Hello, everybody. I thought I'd record a quick video intro off my phone because I'm out of town. I'm in Denver. I'm here. I'm dog sitting for my assistant, Rihanna, who does all sorts of behind the scenes work for this show with social media and sometimes lining up past guests and managing email, all sorts of miscellaneous stuff that I am not good at all. Here's her dog, by the way, Darwin. If you happen to be watching this on video, you're in for a treat. Vishlu, cuddly bud. Get into it. If you like cuddling with a dog, get a Vishlu. I wanted to do a little intro because we kind of didn't mention the One Health initiative that much in this episode, but it is a One Health Initiative episode. The One Health Initiative is just a large global kind of interdisciplinary initiative trying to do just connecting a lot of human and veterinary health with environmental health and the mixing of all of these insane number of fields that go into the emergence of really important matters like global warming and zoonosis, the continuing proliferation of the spread of disease in our modern life, and the many, many, many things that it is incomprehensible the number of factors that we need to think about in determining this stuff. It's overwhelming, quite frankly, and this is a little way of giving a little window into that through one school, the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Here's the gist. Here's how this happened. I was touring around with my show Stand Up Science before COVID. Had the 200 different scientists on popping in and out of a city. My show outside of Knoxville happened to have a fantastic guest, Nina Pfefferman, theoretical mathematician. Working on kind of the epidemiology and evolutionary biology of pandemics, and hit it off, had a nice time at the show, moved on with my life. Probably would have never even connected again, but then a global pandemic happened. And she was one of the first guests that I had on to figure out what the heck is going on with this stuff. And she knew about my enthusiasm in communicating science. And I'm always asking past guests for future guest referrals and suggestions and references and that sort of stuff. She was super helpful, so much so that she thought, maybe connecting with a dopey comedian with a science podcast would be helpful in some way with this initiative. And I'm always looking for awesome guests. And so this is just really a way that you can see. So I'm having all of these different guests from the University of Tennessee, and it's just about raising awareness. That's it, about the One Health Initiative. No one's really selling you anything. You can check out the site if you want. It's just about getting information out there to the public by any means necessary. And because it's important stuff, and there's a disconnect between the sciences and the public. And so I've been looking to do more stuff like this. You've probably heard me express this in the past, but regular stand-up science that kind of initiated my early career just doesn't, it's not as fulfilling as a lot of the science communication stuff that I do. It's great when I can combine both, but I just love this. I love this. This podcast started as a hobby. I love doing it so much. I love hearing all sorts of different people that study things that I would have never thought to look into. So many of the people that I have on, including people with this One Health initiative and people at the University of Tennessee Knoxville that I've been trying to have on once a month or so. A lot of them have never even been on a podcast before. A lot of them don't even have a social media account. You wouldn't hear about their work any other way. And I think if you told the average person about one very specific area of research, people wouldn't really fully understand the importance of why that research is valuable until you start seeing it all pieced together. And that's kind of what the One Health initiative is trying to show. And so I've been working with them. Boy, what I sure hope that I get to make more connections like this in the future and get to do more science communication and get better at it. I honestly don't really know what I'm doing. There's no clear path of how to do this. And so I'm always looking for help in any way that I can. So it's just been an absolute pleasure to connect with all these folks. And so in case you're new to the show and just tuning in, if you go back a year or so, you can see I started having a bunch of guests on kind of talking about this One Health initiative stuff. And we should be kind of building a story together of the many, many interdisciplinary factors that lead to understanding the things that the way the world works, frankly, and a lot of some of the most important things that are often kind of hidden from our awareness. You don't hear a lot about them in the media otherwise, and just stuff that the average person never gets a window into. So that's why I love doing the show. Hope you guys enjoy it. And if you want to support me, this is an ad-free show, other than when I go blabbing on about stuff like this. It's an ad-free show, and it's ad-free because of your support on patreon.com/Shane Mauss. Hooray for science.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I have an exciting episode for you today. We're going to be talking about nutrition. It's a subject that I don't discuss enough on the show. Just had, assuming that I put these out in the order I've been recording them, I just had an episode with Herman Poncer from Duke talking about the evolution of our metabolism, and I thought you'd like to hear a few other takes. It's still January. People are turning their lives around and becoming a brand new human being and fixing everything that's wrong with them. And by the time you're hearing this, you've failed. Many of your New Year's resolutions have been an epic failure. And so it's now time to reassess again. And we're going to get a lot of great information for you. We're going to fill in a lot of my gaps that I have, because it's just not a field that I know that much about. Coming from the Department of Nutrition at the University of Tennessee Knoxville, Hollie Raynor is joining me today. Hollie, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
So you are the director of the HEAL Lab, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about your background?
Sure. So that's a healthy eating and activity laboratory. And what we do in the lab, or the research that I focus on, is really thinking about how can we enhance what we call multi-component lifestyle interventions, which are interventions that focus on healthy eating or different types of eating, physical activity, using behavior change approaches to assist with overall weight management. And the topic of my research pulls together the disciplines that I've been trained in. So I have training in both nutrition. So my bachelor's and master's are in nutrition, and I'm a registered dietitian. And then my training in clinical psychology, which predominantly focuses on what we call behavioral medicine. How do we help people change behaviors to engage in healthy behaviors more regularly? So I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. So my overall research agenda pulls those fields together and really focuses on how can we help people be healthier from an eating and activity perspective.
Amazing. I love all of the interdisciplinary approaches. I've had a lot of guests. I try to about once a month have a guest from the University of Tennessee. And one of the advantages of doing that is people get to hear so many different takes from so many different departments and fields, and seeing the interconnectedness between all of these aspects of research into better understanding this existence that we're all in. And in your particular case, especially, this is something that, I like doing episodes about insects or like the psychology of what happens when people lose their wallet or whatever. But nutrition is something that is a topic that people have to think about constantly, every day. And it's also So through most of COVID, there's been a lot of, why aren't people just getting healthy, and why aren't they just eating right, and this and that will fix everything. And from my perspective, it actually seems like it's almost just the opposite problem, where I feel like my whole life I've been inundated with various wellness tips and fitness things and Slim Fast and this new weight machine and I just remember that from a very early age, and it continues today. I have more of a problem teasing apart, well, which of these things actually work? How am I not just a sucker for the new diet shop that popped up in town, the new supplement thing, the wellness oil at or the wellness aisle in the natural grocery thing, and all these things that even when you have the right intentions, how do you know what to do? It's so complicated.
It is. I mean, you're kind of talking about two things that make it complicated. So one is the behavior change component. Like, how can each one of us develop, in a sense, habits in such a way that are healthy and that can be maintained over long periods of time, and how can we be motivated to, engage in choices that help us hit the values that we actually are interested in. So there's that bucket, which is generally, from the field of psychology. And then there's which I always call it, sort of the nutrition trivia aspect, right? So like what's important, from a dietary perspective that can be helpful in terms of either preventing disease or treating disease, and understanding then amongst all the choices that we're making from a dietary perspective, what's going to help us put into place a dietary perspective that's going to help with, again, whatever you're trying to achieve, prevention or treatment or whatever. So those two areas are incredibly complex, and eating behavior itself is just very complex. So if we had all the answers, obviously, I wouldn't have to do the research that I'm doing, but it's pretty challenging.
There's so many individual differences as well. As you talk about the kind of hitting the values, people's values. Well, people's values and people's identity are huge in this. It's you can hear. I like doing some yoga. I've heard things about it being oversold and various things. Everyone has different takes, but I'll go to one class and it will be some person talking about the anatomy of this muscle doing this, and this is why it helps with balance. And then I go to another class and someone's talking about chakras or whatever. And I hear about chakras and I start gagging a little bit. I want to hear the sciencey sounding word salad that I don't actually understand. And that's more convincing to me, even though they're both doing the exact same movement. It's easy for me to make fun of one or gravitate to another, but all of these kind of approaches are going to hit everybody a little bit differently.
No, you're absolutely right. And like from a psychological, viewpoint, when we're talking to people about values is, for many people, part of the challenge of engaging in healthy behaviors is of competing values in different areas of their lives. So most people will say, I really value being healthy. Like I really value, being able to have better, blood sugar control for my diabetes, for example, or, I want to try and get off some of the medications that I'm on. My health is really, really important to me. I want to have the energy to play with my grandkids or et cetera. But on the other hand, engaging in healthy behaviors may also, to help hit those values, may compete with other values the person has. So for example, maybe they've got a social network in which eating out is really important, so that they are out at restaurants and, having this relationship with other people in their lives. And that's important to spend time with those individuals, but it makes it harder then to make choices that fit this other value in their life. So from a psychological perspective, that's part of the challenge that many people have, is that they've got these competing areas. One thing that we oftentimes talk to people about from a dietary perspective that can be healthy is like meal planning and, planning out for grocery shopping. And then how are you going to prepare your meals, which is true. All those things generally are helpful for people in terms of meeting dietary goals that they may have. But those things also take time, right? So that may take time away from engaging in other things that somebody values, or potentially they may have other people in their lives in which that type of framework doesn't fit well with their values. So we oftentimes think of all those things as sort of like competing values that somebody's having to negotiate, which can make it very challenging to engage in healthy behaviors, even though that's something that somebody values. So it becomes less about, from our perspective, it's not about, many times people will say like, well, you're just not adhering to, what you need to be doing. It's just these other competing things in their life.
Have you ever heard the Mauss study where they have a mouse on a wheel that's allowed to run whenever it wants to, and and then they have another mouse on another wheel attached to that wheel, and it is then forced to run whenever the other mouse chooses to run. And they measure stress and everything else. And so they're both these are doing the exact same activity, but one is choosing to run when it wants to, and the other is having a very
No
similar
choice.
stress response, but getting that amygdala going, that fear response going,
Yeah.
and it's a negative stressor. They don't have control over the situation. They don't have predictability over it, even though it's the exact same movements.
Yes. Yeah. Choice is incredibly important in terms of what we call, especially from a behavior perspective, like reinforcing value. So yes, so like if I have a choice, if I feel like I have a choice to engage in certain things, again, that feels more reinforcing to me, much more pleasurable, much more positive. The removal of choice does not feel so good. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm really curious into getting down to some of the, if someone's choosing, this is a good time of year for people to be choosing. I actually think New Year's is an unfortunate time for people to be setting goals because you're still hunkered down for the winter for a while. I think springtime would be the easiest time for people to use a bit of motivation and enthusiasm and energy and get sunlight.
When there's more light and more warmth outside. I
think you'd be setting yourself up for a little more success in the average individual. But going back to these individual differences and what resonate, I mean, if you go to a self-help section, you see like the two big ones over the last decade is just imagine everything's going to come your way, and as long as you send out positive thoughts, this will alter the quantum universe, and you just got to keep them positive. The universe loves receiving positive thoughts and will return the favor by delivering the things on your dream board or whatever. And then you just need to keep cynical things like learning physics and neurobiology out of it. And then there's like the bootstrappers that are just the opposite. Like, the world's not going to give you anything. You got to fight through the Tough Mudder competition, and you got to do all this. And then if you get enough obstacles, you'll become a real estate agent and such. And then I have my own biases where I like to just throw in the towel, Holly. I'll tell you, I gravitate toward futility to a really delusional extent. I'll give up before I've even started in the day, and so we all have such vast those first two things that I make fun of. Again, if that resonates with a person, that will be absolutely life-changing for that person, that it suits their identity. And for me, I'm just like, I don't want to hear any of that. That will never motivate change in me. So are there actual, like, fundamental, simple things that you see to have the most? No one's saying there's a magic bullet. Things aren't going to work 100%, but you have just really simple list of things that you could give to an entire population. What would you do? No pressure.
Yeah. I do feel like, and obviously there's a lot of evidence to support this. We usually, in the type of work that I do, we usually implement this for somebody to think about their own household or their work environment, but it can also be thought about more broadly, like from a policy perspective. It truly is thinking about like our overall environment that we are encountering, and sort of how much does it help or not help an individual in terms of healthier choices. And so if we were able to put into place an environment in which, healthy eating choices and physical activity choices were automatically prompt, and somebody didn't have to think about it or plan or whatever, that would be super, super helpful. Now, our environment, obviously, unfortunately, is not like that at all, and has moved away from that over time. So that is one of the reasons why people who...
Could you
go ahead.
Could you dig into that? Could you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So I'll just talk about this like from an eating perspective. So one of the areas that I do research in is what's called variety. So variety of choices or eating different kinds of things actually promotes more eating. And the easiest way to think about this is what happens to many people when they're at a buffet, for example, is that they usually will eat more. Not that they go into it hungrier, but they usually will eat more because there's more choices per se. There's more stimulation. We think, the group of collaborators that I have, we think that this is a function of what's called habituation. So individuals will continue to respond to a stimulus as the stimulus is changing. As the stimulus is consistent, the response will diminish more rapidly. And so the easiest way to think about that from an eating perspective is if you're kind of eating consistently the same things, you won't probably eat as much. But if you're constantly having new things introduced in a meal, in a diet, consumption will continue, increase, or it'll be engaged in for longer periods of time. So from that, if you think about just our food supply, for example, we know that the overall types of products that people can purchase and can consume now are so much more than they were 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Even just think about like what grocery stores looked like, right? And especially the variety of our food supply hasn't increased in those foods that we consider to be the healthiest. So it's not like we have all of a sudden all these different kinds of varieties of fruits and vegetables. We have all these different varieties of cookies and ice creams and potato chips and cereal. So that change in that environment then means that that's going to encourage us automatically out of our consciousness, to consume more.
Yeah.
And so if I'm constantly in that environment, exposed over and over and over again to all these wonderful choices, it's harder for me. I have to work harder in a sense. I have to work harder to manage my eating.
Yeah,
and so by changing the environment, it can either help, with, in a sense, making eating less, or it can actually promote consumption. And so we can look at this in lots of different places. Besides grocery stores, it can be like when you go out to a restaurant, the menus, what the options are, again, so much more than they used to be.
And I have to get an appetizer, and I have to get a dessert because this is a night out. And
Right. And so that's an environmental characteristic that has changed tremendously over time that we feel like is, contributing in a sense or making it harder for people to engage in healthier choices. Another big change is portion sizes. So what a portion size looks like, or what people think a portion size is, like what one serving is, has also tremendously changed over time. And so we know, again, there's lots of data that show you put more food in front of a person, they just eat more. So if now my portion is, double the size that it used to be, I will probably eat more just because, again, of that stimulus that's in front of me. Or I have to work harder to leave food on my plate or not eat at all, or that kind of thing. So those two things alone, we think, are big drivers of what makes it harder for people that is purely in the environment, that has nothing to do with like what people know about nutrition, their values, anything like that make it more challenging for people.
I love that. It's so when you talk about, if it's always, listeners to this podcast should know we spend a lot of time talking about the subconscious mind and various cues and primes that we aren't very privy to. But this isn't common knowledge out there for a lot of folks. Don't spend a lot of time thinking about why they think what they think and what might be driving their behavior in ways that they aren't consciously aware of. And we're so mismatched with the environment that our brain and these preferences were shaped in are very different than we really aren't built for the world that we've built for ourselves. And it's funny to think that our hunter-gatherer ancestors would, it probably was not unusual to be desperate enough to take a chance at eating some berry that might be poisonous because you need to get that nutrition. And now you have this threat of going into a grocery store and you're paralyzed by choice. And now there's all these incredibly delicious slow poison. I think it's being I don't subscribe to the ice cream is toxic and poison and you should never treat yourself to anything. But man, we are taking a brain that evolved 200,000 years ago and maybe changed the last time 75,000 years ago or so, and sticking that brain in a grocery store in some weird Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure situation that we're all in. We're really set up to fail in a lot of ways.
We are, and that's one of the things that we talk to many of the families or people that we work with is, people think that they should be able to be in an environment with a lot of these, high, what we call high energy dense, highly palatable foods, and just say no. And the answer is, well, that's not how we're designed. We are designed to want those foods because they are energy dense, right? Because exactly like what you were saying, a long time ago for us to prefer those foods was really, really beneficial, really, really helpful to survive, so that you could get more calories per gram that you were eating because you needed that. We're just not in that environment now, but we still physiologically prefer those foods. So if you're going to surround yourself with those foods or have lots of access and expect that you're going to be able to not want it, that's just very unrealistic.
Let me throw some more complexity at you. I'm curious, okay, when you go about thinking about habituation, are you kind of separating or how much are you separating and thinking about satiation? Is that a different topic? Like the feeling of being satiated, and how obviously they're intertwined, but I'm curious to hear what you feel is the difference between those, and continuing down that path. I'm wondering how you tease apart what is habituation, what is satiation, and what is learning. And because when we say you habituate to something and talk about these hedonic treadmills that it takes all the running we can do just to stay in the same place, even if we're hanging out in a hammock. But if it wasn't the case that the brain habituated, it wouldn't learn. We would all be like, it's very exciting when you see a kid take its first steps, but if you saw an adult walking around like that with that same level of excitement while they're stumbling around, there must be some deficit here, or maybe they're impaired in some way. You need to habituate certain things as an aspect of living. So how do you make sense of all that mess?
Those are really good questions. Traditionally, they are considered separate in a sense that, you're right, habituation is considered to be more of a learning sort of like just to describe any learned response to a stimulus. Whereas satiation, at least from an eating perspective, has generally been thought of as what causes an eating occasion to end. Now, from a nutrition viewpoint, generally people think of satiation as being caused by, in a sense, the physiological properties of the physiological response to the food that's being consumed. So we do know that there are some types of things that we eat that generally have more satiating qualities that will cause an eating occasion to end more rapidly than others. So, for example, we consider solids to be more satiating than liquids. We consider solids that generally have more protein in them to be more satiating than solids that are higher in fat, which is not as satiating, but increases satiety, which is what we consider the time period in between eating occasions. Now, what is interesting is there is something called the gut-brain axis, where we do think that the brain probably and the gut communicate in such a way where learning is happening. We can see this actually in conditioning. So we can see that our body does learn over time, like a flavor, a mouthfeel, a smell, and it will begin, it then learns, okay, what is coming in from a nutrition viewpoint? What do we anticipate is going to hit the gut from that smell, taste, mouthfeel? And it will actually start to prepare, in terms of our enzyme release, et cetera, for what's going to come through the system. So there is some learning that's going on. And so that probably then gut-wise may then influence habituation also. So that our body over time is probably learning some to more rapidly habituate or not to differing aspects of things depending on, usually it is considered to be related to what we call like sort of the orosensory exposure. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's we solved everything. We figured it all out. Life over, complete, solved, mysteries, no more. What about, is there truth to the idea that in terms of your brain gut communication, what you just said was really fascinating about learning over time. And we've talked about things like sauce béarnaise syndrome before of you have like the bad night with tequila or whatever, and you never eat it again, or you go out for pizza at a place.
We learn that response rapidly. Taste aversion, we learn rapidly. Yeah.
Yeah. But so things that's just kind of like a exaggeration of a more nuanced thing of kind of what you're saying. And I'm curious if the brain, if there's anything to the idea that the stomach takes a while to signal to the brain that it's full, and it does, right?
It does, and that's where this overall learning over time is thought to be helpful. So if the brain begins to associate that orosensory experience is going to produce X, whatever that X is, then the body will better understand how to respond. So then again, that this is where variety is problematic, right? Because as you don't have consistency and as you're mixing it up, the body has a harder time learning, understanding that. And so that also can be problematic. Another area in which it's problematic, this is not where I do a lot of research in, but there are concerns, I guess maybe is the best way to describe it, from some researchers about we have a lot of modified foods in our food supply. So, we change predominantly the macronutrient composition of the food to try to, make it have less energy in it, or maybe less fat or something like that. But those foods are designed to mimic, at least oral sensory wise, the real food. So again, our body may get confused if someone is consistently switching in between the modified and the real version. The body can't learn like, okay, well, what's coming down the pike here? Is it the fat-free version, or is it the fat version? Because obviously that
interesting.
means different things for how our body is going to digest, the food. So
right, because you're still taking the same visual cue. I'd never, wow, I'd never really thought about like that before, because I had, I'm a big believer in the small plates. I've been, because I want to put on weight. I'm in a fortunate position where I've been just naturally skinny my entire life, like my whole family is. And so I have to do the opposite of most things. So I get as big a plates as I can to fill it. And I eat as fast as I'm about the fastest eater you'll ever see, because if my stomach gets wind that there's eating happening, it's like, whoa, hey. So I have to trick as much food as I can down there before it gets wise. But I never thought about that visual component before.
Yeah.
And the idea of something that, like, your visual system clearly not telling the difference between, say, fresh pressed juice or something like that, and some concentrate Kool-Aid type beverage. Huh.
Yeah. Again, if we generally are making consistent choices, whatever they are, our body goes like, oh, I get it. This is what's going to happen. But if we don't make consistent choices, which again, our sort of environment really encourages us, to make inconsistent choices. If you talk to people, people are like, I can't eat the same thing regularly for lunch or dinner. That is so boring. When our bodies would probably actually be like, well, that's actually okay.
Yeah, the body's okay with it. Not as much your taste buds.
Right.
Yeah. Give your body a chance to learn something. That is a really cool take. Oh, I love that. Because I had. Have you seen the research about kind of counting your gulps? You give someone, those counters that like a bouncer or whatever will have for counting things. They'll give people those while they sit and eat, and they let people eat as much as they want. And when people in the experimental condition, when the control condition, they eat whatever they want. The experimental, they do as well, but they have a counter and they click the thing every gulp that they take. Those people in the experimental end up eating less. I couldn't tell you how much. I don't know the name of the study off the top of my head, but something I've thought a lot about in the past. It's fascinating, and it's triggering this subconscious mental feeling of satiation, in the same way that having a smaller plate and finishing it is still like, oh, I finished. Whether it's a large plate or a small plate, it's still a cue that you've finished.
Yeah. Or just increasing awareness, if we can pull sort of eating into awareness where it just isn't happening and people just are very unconscious of it, at least in the minimum, then they can make conscious decisions, right? I'm consciously deciding to engage in more or engage in less, or to choose this or to choose that. So we also try to put things into place, which we call it generally monitoring, like monitoring your eating, which traditionally has been more like, well, now app-based, but there are lots of devices. I have a colleague that they're working on, something that's related to sensors on, that would be around the face, in which you would be aware of sort of like what's happening from a chewing, swallowing viewpoint.
Wait, what is that? So, what do you mean? Like you're seeing it in like you're seeing like some.
Well, like if you wear like a device, like you can put like a device over like your ear, and if it can sort of measure your movement of your jaw, right? It can potentially then be tracking in a sense. If an algorithm can be developed appropriately, it can sort of track what's going on, what you're eating, what you're consuming, and potentially then it can be paired with an app and give you feedback, and so you can actually see, what's happening in real time. So that's from a technology viewpoint, that's sort of at least the field that I work in, where sort of people are going to help us better understand, what are people eating? Because traditionally for a long period of time, we've used self-report, which we know is incredibly biased.
Yeah, I ate pretty good yesterday.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Very few people, weigh and measure their food, even when they're in a program in which they're encouraged to. I mean, it's very rare. So then people are like, I don't know, that was like a cup. And who knows if that's right.
Yeah, I've just there's this guy, Hedonic Health. He listens to every podcast I've ever put out, both this and a new one I started last year, and does personal training and nutrition stuff, and reached out to give me a free month of things. So I've been going to the gym consistently. Which has been nice, actually strength training for the first time in my life. But the nutrition stuff, there's like pages of things, and it still feels I haven't started it because it's still overwhelming for me. And it's still like, well, I don't know, it's a fist's worth of the way in which we measure these things. I'm like, then I got to keep track of it. And, you need to be in the right place in life to be like, okay, I can do that now. Yes, I'm going to start thinking about that. Yeah, and I think it's really one thing that fascinates me is how little satiation has to do with fullness. Of course, fullness is the physical fullness of your stomach is a factor indeed, but it would surprise most people to find out how many other factors there are in the feeling of full, or be mindful of that. Of course, we've all had the experience of being absolutely stuffed, and then, you know what, I'll have some popcorn with the movie right afterwards, or the dessert menu comes around and you're like, actually, I might be able to squeeze in creme brulee or 3. Even though a moment ago you were there's no way I could pack another thing in there. And
you're right. And the opposite of that is, hunger too. I mean, that's another feeling I think that's really challenging for people. I mean, as we're working with people in terms of helping them develop healthy lifestyles, having discussions about, that hunger is like a normal, natural, feeling. It should occur multiple times a day. Like, before you have your lunch or before you have your dinner, you should actually feel hungry. That it's not this horribly aversive, so being able to like sit with it and sort of feel okay. I mean, there are a lot of people that are like, I don't want to feel that hunger. So, trying to think about, I mean, oftentimes, obviously from a dietary perspective, we are thinking like, what can we put into place to help prevent hunger? But at some point, there has to be a good balance, of these feelings. They're both normal, natural,
Yeah. When I was thinking of, so if the goal was to get people, if the goal this is for people's bodies, they're eating more consistent meals, but psychologically that's too boring and they're getting satiated quickly or something. What about, so I had an episode on Satiation that ran one of my favorite studies, which is they have people pick their favorite songs, a favorite song of theirs, and then they play. Boy, I wish I could remember who my guest was. I'm the worst with names. Hollie, I'm going to be in future episodes. I'm going to be butchering your work to some other guest and forgetting your name, and it's a nightmare. But the idea was that you play the chorus or whatever, the hook of their favorite song to them 20, 30, 40 times in a row or something. And it's, people in the study actually get mad for having been in the study. They're like, you ruined my favorite song. I can't listen to this anymore. And they get satiated with something that is their favorite song. They can't get enough of this. Oh, well, I'll show you. Listen to it 40 times in a row. You'll have enough of it. But what's really interesting is what they then studied after they created that condition. They then studied ways in which you could get people's kind of appetite for that music going again. And what you do is if you had someone come back in the control condition, they wouldn't do anything. They would just play that song again to them, and they'd be like, that song again, you evil bastards are cursing me with this again. But in the experimental condition, what they would do first is they would have people make a list of all the music that they had listened to over the last week. And that triggered a sense of, I've actually had a lot of musical variety in my life over the last week. Yeah. And then they were able to reappreciate their song again. Very interesting. Isn't it? I wonder if there's something that could be done with that in terms of if, I think a lot of people are getting into these meal plan things, and there's ones that are being easier and delivered to your door, and you don't even need to think about it. It's pre-made this and that. But people still might get kind of bored with eating the same thing over and over again. I wonder if there are ways to trick ourselves into basically being okay with building these consistent habits of eating.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about, at least from my perspective and the research that I do, that's sort of what we're trying to figure out is like, what is the degree of variety that is does not promote problematic consumption, but that is not so limited that it's tolerable to people, that people feel okay with it. And there may be things that can be done, which we do know from an eating perspective, there are lots of things that contribute to variety that have nothing to do with sort of the physiological, like the energy or the macronutrients or anything that are provided from the food. So things such as changing the color or changing the shape that people will feel like that's variety, or how it looks like that it's actually arranged. So those are things that potentially could be done, or potentially different types of flavorings that don't contribute. So different kinds of herbs or seasonings or those kinds of things. So that would provide variety without it being problematic. So that would be one way to try to figure out how to, harness variety in such a way that it's not detrimental, but still works for people.
We need to get back to playing with our food. Essentially, we need to normalize adults playing with their food again. I want to. It's been so long since I've made a mashed potato castle, and I'm like, why haven't I made a mashed potato castle since I was like 5 years old? I'm missing out. Maybe that's the solution.
Maybe, yeah, absolutely. Or rather than even just having things separate, is to like figure out a way. Can you make them all combined in a sort of like casserole or soup or dish or something like that. So again, it's kind of the same, but it's different. So we have the same, we don't have as much data on it, but it's sort of the same issue for physical activity. Now we want to use variety for physical activity because obviously we're trying to actually increase that behavior. So there is data that shows that the modality, so like walking, biking, running, so people that engage in more different kinds generally have more activity, but we don't know if it's as fine-tuned. So does it matter if you're doing your activity, let's say it's walking, for example, if you're walking on a treadmill versus walking in the park, is that the same or is that variety, in terms of what you're doing? Versus walking and listening to music or, so we don't know, hasn't been quite as much research done in variety and physical activity to see if it is as fine as for eating. We know for food, it could be the exact same food, but if you change the flavor or change the color, that's a variety aspect.
Interesting. What about exercise and the idea of surprising your muscles? Because right now the plan that I'm doing, it's pretty simple. It's doing a lot of the same exercises and just adding weight each time. And it's for the first time in I've tried lifting weights and doing CrossFit and other things before, and it's just been like pulling teeth all the time in the past. And this has just felt more like meditative and relaxing. Maybe I'm in a different stage of life, whatever. But is there anything to the idea of like, you're supposed to change up your muscles. If you go to the gym, you got to like put your muscles through some haunted house of like, whoa, what the heck is going on? Why am I doing an overhead squat and then jumping with one leg and clucking like a chicken with it? Is there anything to that idea of trying to surprise your muscles?
I think exercise physiologists do think of sort of that interval training, cross training as important, mostly in terms of recovery, right? So if you're constantly overusing the same muscles, that doesn't give them the recovery that they potentially need. So at least when I've talked to exercise physiologists about variety, they always think about variety from that perspective, which is it could be, walking or running at different speeds. So for them, they think of that as variety because of this, potential difference that it's engaging in, which, that makes sense to me, but I'm definitely not an exercise physiologist.
Well, let's pretend you are, and let me throw you another thing at you. A real life anecdote I'm genuinely a decision I've been contemplating lately. So I got heavy into pickleball, and are you familiar?
Not really. No.
It's like tennis and ping pong combined. It's like a shorter court than tennis, and most of it's played like right up at the net with a wiffle ball. And so it's really good it's an old person sport usually because it's all you need is good reflexes. You don't need to, it's good for people with bad knees and stuff. So you can, there's like 75-year-olds that are incredible at it, that have been playing tennis their whole lives, but they can no longer, sprint around quite as much. So anyhow, I got into it just because I like beating seniors at sports for my own validation. But I got obsessed, right? So here's where this is going. So I've been playing 5-6 times a week, and I've been thinking, I think that there's diminishing returns for my body if I'm doing that. I'm not, like you said, I'm not resting enough, blah, blah, blah. And is it more in my interest to, do pickleball 3 times a week, and those other 3 days a week that I'm going to go and do a sport, do like rock climbing, or I've been thinking about swimming instead, to kind of every other day be mixing it up a little bit more? Am I going to get am I going to get more of a value if I'm going to spend 2 hours doing some sport each day, no matter what? Am I going to get more of a value mixing up what those 2 hours are? I guess is the short way of. I ask some long-winded questions, don't I? My audience is used to it.
I know. I'm like, I have to like keep my
I know.
focus on you and be like, okay.
Yeah.
I think. I do think that exercise physiologists do think that having some variety is a good thing from a physiological viewpoint.
Okay.
From a behavior viewpoint, here's the interesting thing, which I have never seen like a head-on study to examine this, but so as what we've talked about from a habituation viewpoint, one would say like that's totally makes sense because you've got more variety in your activity, and so that's going to encourage you to engage in more physical activity. But the other behavioral part is like, well, you know, we do know that physical activity does really well when it's a very habitual activity, in a sense where, you know, you're doing the same thing kind of at the same time, so that you've got all these cues, in a sense, right, that prompt you to just like, I'm just going to do it. I don't have to think about it. Whereas with variety, you've got to sort of plan and think a little bit more. So people who really focus on physical activity as a habit, developing a habit, might say, well, that's going to be problematic because it's going to be hard for you to develop a habit, or more challenging. So I guess depending on which way you're looking at it, I would say, yes, it's a good thing. Or some people might say like, oh, maybe it's a challenging thing. How's that for a scientific response? I
love it because it's basically like, I don't know, a lot of ways of looking at it, which sounds very scientific to me. That rings as true. Here's something that you learn something new. It changes your lens. I consider myself an epiphany chaser. I'll lug through a lot of boring stuff that I'd rather not be learning about for the off chance that one day I'll be like, oh my gosh, that made me see the world in a whole new way. I was a small plate evangelist for a bit. I think I still probably am, but it seems to me that in terms of the difficulties of, again, putting our hunter-gatherer brain in our modern grocery store, everything that comes along with it, running on a treadmill with a hunter-gatherer brain, there's nothing more insane than running in the same place to go nowhere. That's to train your brain away from every reasonable intuition to stop you from doing that. It seems like a nightmare. Seems so challenging. Obviously, it comes with rewards, but to me, one of the simplest things you could possibly do is just throw out those dishes, get smaller plates, just get used to using smaller plates and see how that works for you. It seems like cultures that use bigger and smaller plates, there's a difference in obesity. There's probably a lot more factors going on than that, but what do you think about small plates?
I mean, people definitely hypothesize that smaller plates and cups and utensils should be helpful. I think the
smaller utensils.
Yeah. Like use a smaller spoon, use a, rather than like a big spoon, use a smaller spoon, even in terms of also serving yourself, right? So let's say like if you're like, if you're eating a meal family style in which like the food is all on the table and then you're putting it on your plate, that again, sort of like the serving spoon, all those kinds of things, people are like, that might have an effect. And the evidence is mixed. So we don't really have any sort of like good, I don't know, strategy, recommendation or whatever to say, if you use it this way, however you want to describe it, this will be effective. But certainly, yes, it is definitely hypothesized that those things can be helpful.
Yeah. Huh. Well, so theoretically, we all just need to start playing with our food and having like little weird Alice in Wonderland tea parties where we're all drinking out of thimbles and such. This is, I want to go to this island where we're trying to make these things take off. So I'm from Wisconsin originally. I've traveled a lot through the South and Bible Belt and stuff where you currently reside. Huge portion sizes, and I'm not saying it's necessarily the only factor in higher obesity rates, but man, my hometown. So I'm a bit of a foodie. I'll eat anything, but I do like finding and exploring fine dining and patting myself on the back for being cultured and this and that. And so my hometown, there was no good fancy restaurants for the longest time. And then there's this place in La Crosse, Wisconsin that opened called the Waterfront, probably the best place in town. And when it happened, I was like, this is amazing. This is so good. And then I went and looked at the reviews, and everyone that was from out of town there on business loved it. Finally, La Crosse has a good restaurant. Anyone that was from town was like, I paid $9 and I still wasn't full, and just lost their minds over it. Another example, there's this restaurant. It's still good. It's called Four Sisters in La Crosse. I recommend it, but it used to be much better, in my opinion, when it started. Tapas place. Super fun. I love tapas. You got the small plates, but I love variety, honestly. And I like the sharing style. But I remember I'd be visiting, and my mom would be like, where do you want to eat? And I'd be like, well, we should all go to Four Sisters. And she'd be like, it's good, but I don't know, I'm just hungry, like I want like a real meal. I'm like, oh, you get more plates. And I'm trying to get through to my adorable Midwestern mom who hasn't traveled much in her life and is not used to this idea. And I'm like, yeah, but you just get more plates. And then my similar, adorable, naive sister comes over and it's like, where are we going? I'm like, well, I want to go to Four Sisters. She's like, I'm hungry though. Like, I want, like, maybe we can go there for an appetizer. And it's just this idea of small plates is just really, I mean, I think it would change a country like America to start implementing more, but I think you would have a lot of people throwing fits trying to implement such a change.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, especially with eating out. I think there's this expectation of large portion sizes. And so when you don't get them, it is sort of like, well, wait a minute. So, it's just, changed a lot as compared to, I don't know, 40 years ago or something like that. So it's very, very different. Yeah. Yeah.
So what about, I would say that my listeners, I don't know, I should look. I would say maybe the average age is 35, something like that. So yeah, I have a lot of listeners with young kids, and this is, as we are fortunate to continue to progress and become more mindful of these things, something that all these things that my parents and no one I know's parents thought about when I was a kid, the things that we're discussing right now are now something that are like becoming a lot more common knowledge. What do you see as some of the difficulties with being a good parent in terms of providing the right kind of nutrition for your children today, and what modern opportunities might they have that, say, our parents didn't have when we were kids?
One of the challenges, I think, for many families actually sounds not very positive, but are actually parents themselves, right? So one of the big, I guess, sort of predictors of how a child sort of thinks about the food choices that they make and that kind of thing are actually modeled from their parents. And so because we have so many adults, which would be the case for, again, sort of this change over the past like 40 years, because we have so many adults now that are challenged with engaging in healthy eating themselves, for families and for kids, it becomes really challenging because there's not a model sort of in place that's sort of guiding that development. And then for young kids, we do believe that, what you're exposed to, like the tastes and that kind of thing, are going to influence a bit, your overall preferences over time, your food preferences over time. Now, there's just some natural developmental changes that happen in food preferences in individuals that you can see. But if your choices are not really, as you're a child, if you're not having a lot of choices related to those healthier food choices, it becomes harder for preferences to develop for those foods, which then might make it challenging, or we believe has made it more challenging for people as they then grow into young adulthood, et cetera. So that's a challenge that families have, is that parents themselves are challenged with engaging in healthy eating habits more so than they were 40 years ago. So that was part of your question. Let's see, what the other part was, what's a benefit now? Is that, am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, maybe just in terms of the, what we've learned in terms of the information that is available now, and certainly, something like Whole Foods or, these natural grocer and, co-ops and stuff like that weren't nearly as possible as popular when I was a kid, or simply didn't exist. And for all of the kind of pseudoscience that will also come along with some of those things, and slapping organic and this and that on things that maybe aren't always, I still, to me, it does look like progress in a lot of ways in terms of our ability to make healthier choices and be more informed about what we're eating.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just the whole concept of, even though we don't know if it's had any influence on choices that people make, but just even the whole thought of like farm to table, right? Like that wasn't like a concept that was around. I mean, that's a fairly new concept, but it is a fairly healthy concept, right? So thinking about, how local produce is grown and how can you actually gain access to that and use that in a healthy way. So the focus is on like fresh and whole and real. And so one would think that would be something that might be helpful to, or the concept of farmers markets, having more access to farmers markets, those kinds of things. Now, the challenge is, some people will say, is that, to utilize that approach, there needs to be good culinary skills in the household. And do most of our households have good culinary skills? I'm not sure that that's the case. And then the other component related to that is just, which I would say is the biggest factor that everyone talks about as an impediment to engaging in any healthy behavior, is just time. So that concept of if I've got to spend time really, accessing food and then preparing food, it becomes a time issue that by far is the biggest. Everybody you talk to says that time is a barrier for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It takes a lot of time to cook a good meal. And what about the food pyramid that was around in schools, 35 years ago or so, that I grew up seeing in first grade, that I have no idea what it was because I didn't pay attention then, and still don't now. But has that food pyramid, does that thing still exist? Has it been revised?
It's been revised. It's now called, at this point in time, it's called My Plate. The newest version of the dietary guidelines haven't been, I mean, My Plate hasn't really been changed. Not that the newest guidelines that just recently came out are like vastly different. They're not. But it is called My Plate. Is it tremendously different than like the original food guide pyramid? I think what's really different when I think about, what has changed over time, to be honest with you, I think the biggest, and I'm thinking about like when I was an undergraduate. So I went through my undergraduate degree, like in the mid to late 80s. So when I think about like what seems really different then as compared to now, when we think about healthy eating to prevent chronic disease, it's how we think about, honestly, carbohydrate and fat. So when I was an undergraduate, we thought that fat was like the worst thing ever. Like, you should limit fat. This was like the real low fat push. All fat is bad. Try to get it out of the diet as much as possible. And I would definitely say we're not there anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, even just the thought of somebody consuming a diet that was 40% energy from fat is part of our recommendations now, that it can, sort of be that high. But this recognition of that there are different kinds of fat, and some fats are actually very healthy and good for us. Now they're energy dense. So you need to you need to be aware of like how much you're consuming of them. And that carbohydrate, most likely should be consumed in much more moderation than we thought in the 80s. So that by far is the biggest change, even though it doesn't necessarily look like that tremendously in the graphics.
And what about, because we are talking about, you've made a lot of the point about trying to maybe build consistency as in that more than what the consistency is the consistency itself maybe being a larger contributing factor to health than people realize. But say, people are listening, New Year's didn't work out, but I'm ready now. And I would think that if you wanted to start a consistent habit, why not integrate, healthier choices into that consistency if you can? Can you talk about some of the differences of, because certainly I'm thinking of this study that took the exact same food, calories wise and everything, and in the control just gave it to people as is, and in the experimental processed all of the food and put that exact same food just processed and gave it to people, and the people in the processed condition ended up gaining a lot more weight. And so can you speak to that, some of the just simple heuristics that we know of? Okay, you're going to make a change and build this consistency. What should you build consistency with in a ideal, while still pragmatic world?
Yeah, I think building consistency in food choices. I think for many people, breakfast is the easiest place to start because people don't feel such a need to engage with lots of different, like they feel pretty comfortable eating the same thing regularly for breakfast. So figuring out what is a healthier food choice for you that you can eat depending on if you're busy or not in the morning, because everybody's different, and then try to engage in that pretty consistently. That is probably one of the easiest places to start to build in like a healthy choice and a consistent choice. And we are, which is a new area in nutrition, we call it chrononutrition. There's more and more research that suggests the timing of how we eat is also very important because of our circadian rhythm, with the thought of potentially, which, goes back to like what people used to say, a long time ago, that breakfast may be really an important meal of the day, that sort of eating more energy earlier in the day is much better than eating more energy later in the day. And unfortunately, most of us eat more energy later in the day now. But breakfast, getting started with a consistency and a healthy choice is probably, unless somebody's not a breakfast eater at all, then it's challenging to build that in. But for most people, that's a fairly easy place to start.
Yeah, as you say that, what about, I do wonder about that backfiring toward the night, because we get frustrated with ourselves for not being as disciplined or whatever as we'd like, or as long-term thinkers as we'd like. It's actually humans' kind of superpower. If you look at any other primate, they don't have near the self-control that we have. If you give your dog a treat, it's not mindfully savoring every little and counting its chews and like, well, let's get this plate size down. But I was talking last week, one of my favorite tidbits about grocery stores are kind of filtering people through all those healthy choices first, and the fruits and the vegetables, and look how healthy I am, I'm turning my whole life around. And then you get to the sugar cereal aisle, and now you deserve some Frosted Flakes because you threw some apples in the cart. And for as good as I had someone describe it, gosh, why am I forgetting everyone's name, as our self-control is like a cheetah, like incredibly a cheetah has incredibly impressive speed. Nothing else in the world can run like it. But as soon as it's done, it collapses and it rests for a long time. And our self-control can be like that as well. I wonder if you start the day right, is that in some individuals, is that just going to set them up to fall apart that much more later on, because they've used their self-control, because they can tell themselves stories of they did everything else right through the day?
Potentially, you're right. It is just, again, sort of this concept of, where can you build in consistency in a habit versus sort of, I guess, more coping strategies to address issues. So, but evening eating, especially eating after dinner, for most people, that's the most challenging time period. And what is that a consequence of? Is that a consequence of, like what you're saying, oh, I've done much better earlier in the day, so therefore it's okay? Is it a consequence of an individual has just had to use so much of their psychological resources and other parts of their day that they have or it's just very challenging. And when they walk into a house and they know that there's cookies and chips there, it's just so much harder to, engage in processes to stop. Is it a habit? Because this is, they're used to winding down their day with some, ice cream, for example. Is it all the above? I mean, the evening is definitely a very, very hard time for lots of people.
Mm-hmm.
Lots.
I really love this idea of, it's something that I need to integrate more into my life, this idea of environmental engineering and kind of the constructing an environment, just assume that your future self is not going to be thinking through every decision you make in some thoughtful, sophisticated way. And much of us are on autopilot most of the time. So those little windows of planning and self-control that we have, we can potentially use them to set things up for our future selves. Maybe taking that jar of mini candy bars and putting them out of sight closed off in a cupboard in the back. So you need to get the ladder out to get up there. And so you can still have it when you want, but it's not the first thing that you walk by when you open the door or walk into the kitchen, those sorts of things. Are you kind of a believer in that sort
Absolutely.
of putting your jogging shoes by the door so you see them all the time?
I mean, I do think that there's only so much capacity, that an individual has. And by setting up the environment to assist, with those choices, it reduces cognitive load. And it just, I think about myself, I love licorice and tortilla chips, love them. If
Together?
They were in my house, sure, why not? But if they were in my house all the time, to every day sort of have to work to not engage in, over consuming that sounds exhausting to me.
Well, this brings us to maybe the most important question of the show. What kind of licorice are you into? Do you like the... You like the little, I'm into like the snaps. I like the snap things that are like the little roll. You into that? You get down with that?
I really like Australian red licorice. It's kind of sticky a little bit. It's a little bit, I'm not sure how it's made, but it's yummy.
We can agree that Twizzlers are garbage and for people that lack any kind of sophistication. I like the candy coated little, like the pill shaped things. Those are
good too.
You get down with absinthe ever? You into it?
No, not so much.
All right. Just asking the tough hitting questions here. I wanted to go back to childhood for a moment before I have I have a couple I think banger questions to close this out. I think it's going to be this has been a fun episode. Childhood development. This is the part of the show I love to do this. The reason why I ask such long-winded questions is because when I walk a guest through the way that I think about things, that gives them the opportunity to correct the many ways in which I'm wrong, which I always am. And it's fun for me. It's fun for the audience. So let's do it. Childhood development. I was taken by hearing a bit of research about, I think this is in Mary Roach's book, Gulp. I think it's called Gulp. Anyway, she's a fun science writer about childhood development and the various stages at which your brain is forming, and what is appropriate to eat is something that you learn early on in life. And there's windows of time where, the parent needs to watch and make sure the baby isn't trying to stick everything in their mouth. Is this pen going to taste good or whatever else? And then there's a period of time where after the age of, I want to say, there's a period of time between 3 and 5 where you're kind of constructing your more rigid ideas of what food is appropriate, and any food that you aren't exposed to, say before the age of 5 years old, is going to take a little more for you to have a taste for early in life. Like, say you're raised in a country that eats bugs or something like that, and you're exposed to that early in life, and then you go somewhere else that doesn't, or vice versa. You're going to be, you know what I'm trying to say? Mm-hmm. Is that a thing where there's kind of windows of child development?
I've never heard that before.
Okay. Next question then.
Sorry.
Let's just, no worries. Let's just assume that it's true.
Okay.
I think that it might be, especially now that I know you don't know if I'm wrong or not. Now I'm like, I actually think it's true. All right. Back to your research. This is what I want to know. Okay. It's two questions. They're the opposite. What is something in your field, some kind of nutritional, behavioral scientific, like kind of consensus or dogma of the day, that you could see like aspects of your work that you believe now that you could see being falsified in the future, having a likelihood of making a discovery that falsifies it in the future? And then the opposite, what are the things in your field that you would say that there is no concrete evidence for believing right now, but you are hopeful? You would not be surprised if in the future it was shown to be the case that, you know, this hypothesis is true once we have more technology or research or whatever else.
Okay, so the first one, what do we believe now that I anticipate we might find false in the future, right?
Or just, or even just maybe walk back some of the claims or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I think there's already a walking back on this of some sort. So in the broad area that I work in, we do really feel like that in comparison to other nutrients, that energy is the most important component from a dietary perspective about weight. So it's not, for example, it's not necessarily about your ratio of protein to carbohydrate or sodium, or like it's basically energy. And so for quite an extended period of time, there's been discussion about like, so then it doesn't matter what you eat from a weight management perspective if your energy intake is if it puts you in a negative energy balance state. So if you are burning more than you're consuming, whatever it is that you're consuming, it doesn't matter. It's all equivalent. And there's just enough thoughts and research coming out. And like you actually, which I think that you were alluding to, potentially Kevin Hall's work, that we do think that it may not be quite that easy. I don't know. So
this is simple. my guest Herman Poncer from Duke University last week wrote a book about human metabolism, which this was one of the big points that he's making in his book, actually, that it's not just as bad news for me because I'd rather just exercise more than watch what I eat. But much of the thrust of his book is it's not, you can't neglect nutrition.
Oh, you can't. You definitely can't. I mean, physical activity has a lot of health benefits that it does not look like that nutrition can, but it's certainly from a weight management perspective, so much of it is driven by your eating. But it may not be a calorie is a calorie is a calorie, that there may be some other components that we need to pay attention to. And again, that concept of processed food versus not, I mean, there's not a lot of literature on that, but that certainly was an interesting outcome. This other thought of chrononutrition, you can eat the same thing, but we are actually seeing different physiological response depending on the time of day that you're eating. So again, that suggests that it's not just straightforward like we think that it is. So I do anticipate some of these like finer things will come out over time that we just don't anticipate right now. So there's definitely a lot of suggestion of that already. So that's not going to be like in the field, people won't be like, oh my gosh, where'd that come from?
And before we get to part 2 of my question, hit me with intermittent fasting. Yay or nay?
I think it depends on how you're, so we classify that under, in a sense, a broad umbrella of time restricted feeding, which can be seen in lots of different ways. So intermittent fasting is one of those. I think it's something that we need more research on, but does it look like that it does something better than other things? Maybe not so much. Are there some concerns that for some individuals it may not be ideal? Probably, but is it incredibly, is it going to have the negative consequences that some people think? It doesn't look like either. But there are components of time restricted feeding, which also includes like the length of the interval of eating that's occurring in the day, as well as, again, sort of how energy is dispersed during the day. There definitely looks like that there's this, especially the time interval looks like that it's really important, which goes back again to this evening eating aspect. So if you cut that out and you push eating earlier in the day, what does that look like? But I'm not going to say for intermittent fasting, I'm not going to say like, oh, that's a horrific thing, but I'm also not going to say it's the best thing ever.
Well, it's at least good to know that it's not some horrific thing, because I think that even if it, as someone that's never tried it, and I know some people that claim they've felt benefits from it, that as there's individual differences, say it wasn't physiologically actually doing anything, it was neutral in that regard, still strikes me as a heck of a placebo effect if you're kind of suffering through not eating and giving yourself a sense of control and predictability over things, while actually feeling like you put some cost, you made some sacrifice, and really feeling that. I can see that in increasing, placebo effects in other aspects too, if nothing else.
No, absolutely. And I will say in the field of nutrition, there's a very, very large push about, what we call precision nutrition, that we're not going to have one dietary recommendation that fits all. And so that means that for us as researchers, we need to identify moderators of the interventions. And the moderators can be, obviously physiological, genetic, behavioral, et cetera. And we've got to figure out then who, which types of goals work best for who. And some of those components are going to be about, like, for some people, what just feels easier to do over time.
Now, the last question, what would you say you're excited about that maybe just can't be explored right now really thoroughly for whatever reason, but you think 10 years from now the science is going to show, hey, this thing that we actually have no evidence for right now was in fact promising and worked out? Where would you place some bets?
Oh gosh. I think the thing for me as a researcher, and part of this is also just my own, professional journey in terms of how I, think about and approach research. I definitely was trained very much as like an individual focused researcher. But we now just have this concept that there's, to really address health issues, we need to think about things much more broadly. And so I think being able to look at our health questions in more, complete ways where we can address, understand things like disparities, which take so much more into account than are just individually, what do you do? And so, I'll just describe one area that I work in. It's a small area right now, which is like food and nutrition insecurity. So that's a very complex problem that involves lots of different disciplines, but it has an impact on dietary intake and it has an impact on health. And so how do we address that, from a research perspective? So getting researchers to better be able to come together from different disciplines to address these complex problems. I'm hoping that we can do a better job 10 years from now.
And what about, you kind of mentioned looking at things from an individual perspective. It seems like a trickier thing to test, but what about this idea of kind of social wellness that I think is more promising? This idea that we are our brains we are not just an individual. We are part of a social network. We are influenced by our friends, our family, the internet, people around us. Our mind, our consciousness is kind of intertwined with that. And the kind of using that in terms of wellness and in terms of, say, like having an accountability buddy, sometimes publicly committing to things, taking part in various classes or the Tough Mudder competition or whatever, where you get to go, or you run the marathon or whatever else with a whole bunch of people. That's something that I think is really tricky to test, but I think shows a lot of promise and intuitively makes sense in terms of getting back to kind of our ancestral roots of what our brain was, how our brain was built to assess reality.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Like, how do we understand the social networks that people have and how that's influencing what they do? So, and which is sort of what we've been talking about from an eating perspective. The social norm in our country is not, from an eating perspective, is not a healthy perspective. And so if you're assisting individuals in trying to pursue this healthy approach for prevention or, again, for treatment, they're in a sense going against the social norm. And so what does that mean for them? Or what do we need to put into place to, address that social norm?
Well, Hollie, you were a fantastic guest. Thank you so much. I had so much fun. I'm long-winded anyway, but I blabbed even more than usual just because I like thinking through this subject matter. It's something that I need to be more mindful of, and I don't know near enough about. So thank you so much for helping share your research with everyone, and I hope people get a lot of inspiration from this.
Well, thank you again for the invitation. It was lots of fun.
Yeah, thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you more next week.